Well, then, all right. In the meantime, let's chat a little bit about the Garth Garwin story. So I have been really fascinated by the Red Maid story ever since I found out about it. And it was funny, you know, Trish will tell you, it was kind of looming over us. She and I started at the same time, and we, like, the two of us tried to fellow up and go through the quest chain up through the Red Maid. And that was like at the time where we were having a hard time even navigating the map. Like, we couldn't even find the Red Maid, much less defeat her.
How many hours did we spend trying to find her?
It was pretty ridiculous. Well, especially since we were like also like being destroyed by Creops regularly during our wanderings. So
yeah.
It was a little time consuming and an ultimate failure. But I think that the Red Maid story is fascinating. Of course, to me, the really cool thing is the way that they have thought through, the way that they have linked it to the Tom Bombadil and Goldberry story. And in particular, to me, the Red Maid story raises the question about who Goldberry is, or sort of what Goldberry is. It's kind of a story that makes you think about Goldberry's nature and kind of the significance of that sort of creature existing in Middle-earth, as Tolkien did in fact choose to stick Goldberry in Middle-earth. She's called the Daughter of the River, right? She's the River Daughter, but like in what sense? Is she the river? Like, how does a river have a daughter? What does that even mean exactly? It's pretty clear, especially when you go back to the original sources, by which I mean like the original poem of the Adventures of Tom Bombadil. You know, we see sort of where Goldberry came from in Tolkien's own thought. It seems pretty clear that she comes from like traditional English fairy stories. Sort of folk tales and stuff. Does anybody remember? Does anybody know the Adventures of Tom Bombadil poem? Does anyone recall how Goldberry and Tom first meet?
Rachel does.
Doesn't she try to drag him down to the water?
Exactly.
Yeah. Like a Jenny Greenteeth.
Yes, they first meet when Goldberry reaches up and tries to drown him as he's walking by the river. Exactly. Exactly like Jenny Greenteeth. Jenny Greenteeth is probably the most famous example of that kind of river spirit. There are a whole bunch of rivers in England that are supposed to have fairy spirits, usually female fairy spirits, usually malicious female fairy spirits, whose tendency is to occasionally reach up and drag mortals who come along to her shores down into the water and drown them, especially children.
Who didn't listen to their mothers.
Especially children who didn't listen to their mothers are especially susceptible to this particular treatment, apparently. Yes, exactly. And that's the kind of thing that Goldberry seems to be. Now, you know, she doesn't seem to be all that intent on actually drowning Tom in the poem, and she doesn't really succeed.
She's flirting.
She's flashing.
There is that kind of element, especially until the Barrow-wight comes up. With the first three, you know, the Barrow-wight is the fourth of Tom's four encounters. He encounters Goldberry, and then he encounters Old Man Willow, and then he encounters the Badgers, and the family of Badgers, and then the Barrow-wight. And there's this sense in all of them that, you know, it's kind of, well, at least in the first three, less so with the Barrow-wight, that it's kind of all good fun, you know, that they're like when Old Man Willow traps him. And again, for people who don't know the poem, it's really fascinating because basically the same way that Mary gets trapped in the, you know, it gets, you know, wedged in and almost swallowed by the tree. That's what Old Man Willow does to Tom in the poem. And then, you know, Tom Bombadil utters the lines which are echoed. They're not exactly the same as the lines in the Fellowship of the Ring. You should not be waking, Old Man Willow. He does those, but the dialogue between Old Man Willow and Tom Bombadil is pretty clearly jocular. Like, they're just having a good time. They seem to be friends. At least that's my reading of their lines. And with Goldberry too, they're not quite as much buddies as Old Man Willow and Tom seem to be. but they're still, it doesn't seem to be completely malicious. But anyway, she certainly has evolved into something quite different. She's not at all like Jenny Greenteeth when we meet her. When she comes to the door of the house of Tom Bombadil, and we get that remarkable paragraph, and he goes, remember the description of her or not the description of her, but the description of Frodo's experience of encountering Goldberry at the door, remember? When he's just completely flabbergasted and blown away by her, and it's...
spouting poetry.
Yeah, he starts spouting poetry and doesn't know why he is, right? He marvels to hear himself speak so. Exactly. And there's that. I've always loved the simile that long extended simile that he uses. It's just, Frodo felt like one who, going to a cottage in the woods to beg a glass of water has suddenly been confronted by a fair young elf queen. It's just like that, because everyone knows that experience. So, we can all relate to our own experiences of suddenly meeting elf queens and woodman cots in the wood. But anyway, that's so it's this remarkable experience that he has. She's clearly greater than just this sort of malicious sprite, which she seems to be related to. But it's kind of hard to say just what she has become, right? So now all of this leads us back to the Red Maid, right? The fundamental story of the Garth Garwin instances and everything is that it's sort of the combination of two basic Tolkienian ideas, right? One is Goldberry and the fact that we have these fairy spirits which are elemental in some ways, related to the earth in some really fundamental way. Again, if we take, is Daughter of the River literal? It is. It seems to be in the original poem. Like Tom Bombadil has an actual mother-in-law in the poem. It's not really clear to me that Tom Bombadil really has a mother-in-law in the Fellowship of the Ring. But is calling her the Daughter of the River merely a way of trying to kind of allegorize her relationship, her nature or her relationship with the land or something? He never really doesn't explain, and it's very sort of mysterious. So you've got that. You've got Goldberry, and on the other hand, you have the idea of evil poisoning the land, right? The impact that evil has on the land, and of course, we see many examples in Tolkien's work of either evil actions or the malice of individuals, or even in a sense like the radiant, malicious personality of an evil creature poisoning the land around it. Of course, most famously in The Desolation of Smaug, as well as the wreck of Mordor outside the Black Gates and all those things. That idea is also pretty prominent, and the way they bring those two ideas together in the Red Maid story, I think, is really interesting. And I'm especially interested in the way that they explicitly connect the corruption of the Red Maid to the shedding of blood, right? The story, if I'm recalling it correctly, the story is that this maid, who is one of the sisters of Goldberry, she is whatever Goldberry is, she is like that. She is one of these sort of water spirit nature women people like Goldberry, and she and so much blood was shed in her river and in its springs that she became corrupted by it. So here we have not only simply the idea of evil poisoning the land, evil influencing the things around it, but the shedding of blood within the river having this influence on her and making her into the Red Maid, making her into this creature who, her own river has been drinking blood for so long that she herself is changed by that. Which again sort of shows us thinking that they're doing about the nature of Goldberry, right? That she is, they're really suggesting this very concrete relationship between her and the river. But I find this I find that particular manifestation of evil corrupting the land, in the shedding of blood in the river, to be really fascinating. It strikes me as a very kind of Tolkienian idea. You think of the other lands in Tolkien's landscape that have been affected by the shedding of blood, right? Like the Dead Marshes or the Brownlands, right? Places that war has swept over and have never been the same ever since, even though there's not really any obvious naturalistic reason why they wouldn't be, right? I mean, okay, so a lot of blood gets shed into ground. 500 years later, I don't think you're going to be able to notice any real effect, in nature, but there's clearly more to it than that. So again, we can see them picking up on that in the Red Maid quest, and then of course they add to that the idea of the growing evil, the growth of the shadow and the spreading of the shadow and the way that the shadow reaches out as it grows. That part of the process. Part of what that means, evil is spreading and the shadow is growing. Those aren't simply metaphors. What that means is, the sort of the active corruption and the active manipulation of corrupt things. Dark things are always being stirred up in Tolkien's world, right? And that's what we see happening here. We've got, this is the culmination also of the Ivar the Bloodhand plot, which gets introduced in the elf and dwarf starter area. And, so the idea that Ivar has been delegated to come down into this region and stir up trouble, and one of the chief ways he does it is through this, to his mind, very conveniently corrupted Goldberry figure. So he's able to take this aggressive, this sort of aggressive Red Maid and utilize her for his plans. And again, that it seems like a very much in keeping with the kind of thing that we can see evil creatures doing. I like one final thing, and then I'll let us go and start killing things. And that is the connection between the Red Maid and the Kingdom of Rhudaur, which it suggests the way that they've built that story suggests even a kind of parallel between the two of them, right? You've got the Red Maid, who used to be a good and innocent spirit, but she's been twisted and perverted by the drinking of blood, right? By the shedding of blood into this horrible and evil and perverted thing. And in a sense, this is almost and there are still these the remnants of the old Kingdom of Rhudaur, the old Númenorian Kingdom of Rhudaur. Has remained loyal to her, so we've got all those hillmen in there that we're interacting with this evening, and the fact that they too, their whole civilization, their whole culture is kind of parallel to what has happened with the Red Maid. That they too were once a good and noble land. I mean, they were one of the 3 Dunedain kingdoms in Arnor. Having the same tradition and the same roots as Arthedain and Cardolan, and yet they too became twisted under the influence of the shadow. So the kind of the parallel between the corrupted River Daughter and the corrupted Dunedain kingdom, and yet again we can still see in the Red Maid instance. One of the things that we see, one of the features of the final confrontation with the Red Maid, is the self-sacrifice of these warriors of Rhudaur, who are all willing to give their life in order to strengthen the Red Maid, and the nobility of that, their willingness to sacrifice themselves and to get, it seems to me that they have. The choice that they've made in depicting these, the remnants of Rhudaur, that these guys are not just like slavering wicked people, but rather, there's this sense of, ancient and noble traditions that have been passed down, but they've been twisted, right? So the people of the warriors of Rhudaur have been twisted and put to evil work, even though they still have, elements of good in them. Again, just like the Red Maid herself. Anyway, That's those are my. Okay, I was about to say my brief thoughts. They're not really exceptionally brief. I guess by my normal standards,
actually,
they were a little bit.
Yeah, for you, that was really brief. Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, exactly. But good. One last quick thing before we go that I almost forgot to mention. This week is, we've just had Mythmoot this past weekend. This week is also the start of classes. We have Tom Shippey's Beowulf class and our science fiction class. We've got 86 people taking Tom Shippey's Beowulf class.
Wow.
It's going to be awesome. It's a huge class, and it's really an awesome opportunity. So
that's great, because even if you audit the class, you have access to the student discussion board, and the discussions on those boards during this kind of class are just absolutely terrific.
Yeah, and there's a great crowd in that class. So the discussion boards, the discussion board's going to be really active in the class. It should be really cool. Yeah. Oh, okay. So Robert Brown isn't content to let me actually let us go. Robert asks, what do I think of the Shades being bound somehow by Eowyn Benadar, who is, of course, Tom Bombadil? Well, there are two things about that, Robert. On the one hand, I have to admit that my very first reaction when I heard that, that these spirits have been bound by Tom Bombadil, I was like, wait a second, he's restricted his power to within his area. Could he do that? But the more I've thought about it, the less that has kind of bothered me. Or rather, I guess I would say, the way I would say it is, my interest in the idea of Tom Bombadil interesting himself in this question has really outweighed my concerns about Tom Bombadil's self-imposed geographic restrictions. I really like the idea, that Tom Bombadil, knowing that this other water spirit, who is like unto Goldberry, has been corrupted. The idea that Tom Bombadil has taken an interest in that and gone off and tried to help her, and even to the point of restricting placing this burden upon these spirits so that they become undead. I mean, that's the way undeadness works in Middle-earth. I like that. I mean, there's, you sort of get this implicit story behind it, right? It's hard to resist the kind of implicit story there, right? That that one can almost hear sort of Goldberry's request to Tom, right? Goldberry sharing her concern about, this, sort of sister, cousin, associate, kinsperson out there who has been corrupted by evil, and, Tom sort of taking up the case and trying to help make things better. I really, really kind of like that idea. Had they decided in LOTRO to kind of make Tom Bombadil just sort of come out and wander around and become a major player in the fight against Angmar, I would have thought that was a pretty big violation of Tom Bombadil's character as it's presented in the books. But the idea that he would, kind of step outside his bounds in order to help out somebody else like Goldberry, that actually I'm sort of fine with that. It's clear, at least even in the book, that he has some knowledge and familiarity with areas outside his bounds, or else he wouldn't be able to recommend the Prancing Pony the way that he does. But anyway,